A black woman walks into a bank with a check for $200,000, but minutes later, the bank CEO calls the FBI to arrest her. It seems like she's about to be taken away, until the agents walk in, solemnly greeting her with a title that leaves the entire bank speechless. Little did they know, the person they suspected was the highest authority in the room. Ariel Monroe, a calm black woman in a beige coat with a determined and calm expression, walked into the bank lobby. Her presence cut through the air like a thunderclap. She wasn't just another client. She was a force of nature walking into a bank that didn't know it was about to make a fatal mistake. Her heels echoed in the quiet lobby, drawing eyes but not for the right reasons. The $200,000 check in her hand was enough to make the bank's manager, Douglas Whitman, blink twice. His voice was steady, but his suspicion was clear. "Ma'am, where did this check come from?" In that moment, Ariel knew exactly what was happening. It wasn't a question of money. It was a question of who she was and what they thought of her. But before she could respond, the tension was broken by the sound of the door opening. Two men in dark suits walked in, and everything froze. "Duty Director Monroe," one of the agents said, and the room fell silent. The woman they had profiled, the woman they doubted, wasn't just anyone. She was someone with power. And it was time they learned exactly who they were dealing with. Real life stories now presents a shocking twist you won't see coming. Watch to find out what happens next, and don't forget to subscribe, because this is a story you won't want to miss. The morning felt like any other. The hum of quiet chatter mixed with the click of polished shoes on the floor. Expensive suits, high-end tech, and coffee sipped like oxygen surrounded the men and women who maneuvered through the lobby with businesslike precision. This was a place where deals worth millions were made with barely a glance, and everyone knew their place. It was orderly, predictable, and almost sterile in its perfection. But then something shifted. Ariel Monroe walked in. Her steps weren't rushed. They weren't hesitant either. Every footfall was measured, like she was exactly where she needed to be at exactly the right moment. The room's energy subtly changed, like a gentle wave hitting a shore. Heads turned. It wasn't her clothes that drew the attention, nor was it her height or anything flashy. It was the way she carried herself. An aura of quiet strength and understated confidence. She wasn't flashy or loud, but she didn't need to be. The woman in the dark green trench coat, heels polished but practical, exuded a silent authority that immediately set her apart. Her posture was straight but not stiff. Her expression calm but far from passive. The room seemed to recognize her presence before she even spoke. She made her way across the lobby, her gaze scanning the desk before her eyes settled on a young teller named Lindsay, who was seated behind the glass partition. In her hand, Ariel held a thick check, $200,000 drawn from an account backed by Legacy Capital, a well-established financial institution. The check's worth wasn't just in numbers. It was in the gravity of her action. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm but with an edge that made it clear she was a woman used to making decisions and not needing to explain herself. Lindsay blinked, clearly startled by the sheer confidence in Ariel's demeanor. Her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before she took the check, glancing between it and Ariel's ID. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough. The hesitation didn't go unnoticed. "I'll need to get a manager to approve this," Lindsay said, her voice unsteady as she stood, almost too quickly, as though her hand had been forced by some invisible pressure. Ariel didn't respond. She merely nodded, her face unchanged. Across the room, branch manager Douglas Whitman had already taken notice. His eyes tracked the check as it passed from Lindsay's hand, and the moment he saw its face value, his brow furrowed and a look of skepticism crossed his features. He walked toward her with a smile that didn't quite meet his eyes. "Ma'am," he began, his voice polite but strained, "may I ask where you received this check from?" Ariel's eyes locked on his, but she tilted her head slightly as if to signal she wasn't threatened by his question. "Maybe from a client," she responded, keeping her voice even, free of any suspicion. But Whitman was already processing what he thought was a much more unsettling possibility. "You're looking to deposit it into my business account?" he asked again, the question lingering in the air. "Yes," Ariel replied simply, her tone not defensive but assertive. Whitman paused, his mind racing. His next words hung in the air, almost too deliberate. Do you mind if I take a moment to verify a few things? Ariel didn't flinch. You don't need my permission. Go ahead. Lindsay, unsure of what to do, awkwardly sank back into her chair. Ariel, however, remained calm and composed, unfazed by the developing tension. She'd seen this kind of thing before. She knew how this played out. The questions, the second-guessing, the scrutiny that always seemed to fall on people who looked like her, who didn't fit the usual mold of who belonged in places like this. 5 minutes later, Whitman returned, his voice louder now, as though trying to mask his nervousness. I've placed a call to the issuing bank, he said, the words a little too stiff, too formal. And just so you're aware, I've also contacted the authorities. Lindsay's eyes shot to Whitman in surprise. The tension between them was thick enough to cut with a knife. Ariel, however, didn't budge. She simply looked at him, unbothered, as if she knew exactly what was happening and as if she didn't care to participate in it. You called the police? Ariel asked, her voice quiet, almost chilling. The FBI, Whitman clarified, his voice suddenly sharper, more defensive. Just as a precaution. If the check is legitimate, there's no issue. Ariel's expression didn't change. No, she said flatly. This isn't protocol. This is profiling. Her words hit the air like a stone skipping across the surface of water, sharp, precise, and impactful. The word hung in the space between them, profiling. It was clear to everyone who was paying attention exactly what was happening here. Ariel, a black woman, was being treated as if she were guilty of something she hadn't done, simply because of her appearance and the size of the check in her hand. The room felt like it had collectively held its breath. The tension was palpable. People shifted uncomfortably, trying not to look, trying to pretend they weren't witnessing a scene that was far too familiar. But they couldn't escape it. The guard by the door shifted his weight, his hand grazing the radio on his belt. Lindsay adjusted her scarf nervously, as if trying to act like she wasn't witnessing an uncomfortable moment unfolding right before her. We're just being thorough, Whitman said, his throat tight with the effort to remain calm. I understand competence, Ariel replied coolly, her voice dripping with quiet authority. But her eyes never left his. Just then, the door opened again. 2 men walked in, FBI agents. They were dressed in dark suits, each exuding an authority that was undeniable. The room stilled as they moved with purpose toward the counter. One of the agents, the older of the two, spoke first. Agents Curtis Dean and Malik Torres, he said, his voice firm and assured. The moment was electric. Whitman exhaled a little too loudly, as if relieved that someone else was taking over the situation. Thank you for coming so quickly, he said, trying to regain control. We believe we may be dealing with a fraudulent instrument, Whitman continued. But the agents weren't looking at him. They were both focused on Ariel. The taller agent, Curtis Dean, nodded respectfully toward her. The younger one, Malik Torres, stepped forward with a subtle change in his demeanor. Deputy Director Monroe, he said, a slight smile forming at the corners of his lips. We didn't expect to find you here. A ripple of shock spread through the room. Lindsay's pen dropped from her hand, clattering to the desk. Whitman's face drained of color, his eyes widening with recognition. Ariel stood tall and unwavering. She didn't flinch. I was making a deposit, Ariel replied, her voice as calm as ever, though it carried the weight of someone who had been underestimated for far too long. Agent Curtis Dean turned to Whitman, his face unreadable. Sir, you called federal law enforcement to investigate a federal official? He asked, his words sharp, cutting through the tension. Whitman's mouth opened, but no words came out. Lindsay, who'd been watching the scene unfold, couldn't help herself. You didn't ask, she whispered, her voice barely audible but clear enough to be heard by everyone. Ariel didn't respond with anger or defiance. She simply let her silence speak louder than any words ever could. Agent Malik Torres picked up the check, examined it briefly, then placed it back on the counter. "It's valid," he said, his tone final. "And so is her ID." He turned to Whitman, his eyes cold. "You've profiled the deputy director of the bureau." The room was silent, and for a moment, no one moved. Ariel reached for the check, folded it neatly, and slid it back into her clutch. "I'll be withdrawing my business account," she said, her words deliberate but not rushed. She turned toward the door, and the moment stretched, but no one stopped her. Whitman opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The bank didn't collapse. The world didn't end. But reputations, those crumbled. Ariel walked out of the bank as though nothing had happened. She didn't slam the door. She didn't scream. She didn't need to. Her presence alone had spoken volumes. As she sat in her car, hands resting on the steering wheel, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. This wasn't new for her. It was just today's version. She'd been through this dance too many times to be rattled by it anymore. Her phone buzzed. A message from Agent Curtis Dean. "You good?" "Always," she replied with a smile. And just like that, the weight of the moment lifted. Later that evening, a voicemail waited for her at home. It was Whitman's voice, nervous, too cheerful. "Miss Monroe, I just wanted to express our deepest apologies for the misunderstanding. It was never our intention to offend." She deleted the message without listening to the end. Instead, she poured herself a glass of water and thought about Lindsay. The next day, Lindsay showed up at Ariel's door, breathless. "I had to find you," she said, handing Ariel an envelope. "I'm quitting. I couldn't be a part of that." Ariel didn't need to read the letter. She simply nodded, understanding more than words could express. "What will you do next?" Ariel asked. Lindsay smiled faintly. "Something better." Later, Grantham and Federal Trust District Office received notice of an immediate asset withdrawal, quiet and clean. No statement. No scandal. But whispers spread quickly. The next week, Ariel stood at a gala, surrounded by the highest ranks of the Bureau. Tonight, she wasn't in the background. She was center stage. When her name was called, the applause started soft but quickly swelled into something sincere, something real. She walked to the podium without notes, her voice steady. "When I walked into that bank, I wasn't asking to be applauded. I wasn't asking to be welcomed. I was asking to be seen as neutral, as a professional, as a person." The room leaned in. "What I got," she continued, "was suspicion. A presumption of guilt without evidence. A script some of us have memorized by heart. But when assumption meets truth, only one of them survives." She paused for effect, letting the weight of her words settle into the room. "I didn't walk out of that building alone. Behind me were thousands who've had their legitimacy questioned just for daring to show up. And in that moment, they were with me." The silence that followed was powerful. Then the applause erupted, not polite, not procedural, but real. Later, as people mingled beneath the soft city lights, Agent Curtis Dean handed her a drink. "You're making waves," he said, a grin on his face. Ariel looked out over the skyline, her eyes sharp, focused. Waves don't ask for permission. Days later, a memo from the Bureau's Internal Affairs Division leaked. It didn't name names. It didn't have to. It referenced reputational risk, updated engagement protocols, and public visibility with financial institutions. But beneath the bureaucracy, one truth stood out: they had underestimated the wrong woman. And she was determined to make sure they never would again. As Ariel walked out of the bank, she wasn't thinking about victory or revenge. She knew this wasn't just a personal win, it was a lesson. Douglas Whitman's mistake had exposed more than just his ignorance. It had shown the world how easily assumptions could tarnish someone's reputation. His call to the authorities, meant to protect the bank, only revealed his own bias. He had profiled the wrong person, and the consequences would follow him long after that day. Lindsay, the teller who had hesitated, showed up at Ariel's door later that evening. With trembling hands, she handed Ariel her resignation letter. "I couldn't stay in that environment," she admitted. For Lindsay, leaving was about more than just quitting a job. It was about rejecting the prejudice she had unknowingly supported. Weeks later, Ariel stood at a gala, the applause for her now genuine and resounding. The respect she had earned was undeniable. She wasn't the person others tried to make her out to be. She was the one in control of her own story, her own future. And for Douglas Whitman, the aftermath was clear. His actions had cost him more than just a client. They had cost him his credibility. The world wouldn't forget how he had treated Ariel. His mistake was now part of his legacy. Ariel had made her point. When assumptions collide with truth, only one survives. And truth had the last word. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can keep spreading stories that truly matter.